the use of these types of tactics in recent years, particularly since 9/11, but even in the last few years in Canada, the US, and Western Europe, it's concerned me and also piqued my interest. Specifically, I think I was really struck by two interviews with Prime Minister Harper. One with Maclean's magazine in July 2011, and then another one with Peter Mansbridge on The National in September of 2011, where Prime Minister Harper seemed to paint a picture of a world that poses many direct and indirect threats to Canada. And one particular threat captured him, and that was Islamist terrorism. Seemingly as a response to this threat and others, he called in those interviews for a more muscular foreign policy that focuses on, and I'm quoting here, focuses less on pleasing everyone, as he saw previous governments trying to do, and more on advancing direct Canadian interests and values, whatever those may be. And these sentiments were echoed in an interview only last week with Al Jazeera with Foreign Minister Baird, where he talked about the need to do away with the moral relativism, quote unquote, of previous governments, Canadian governments, on foreign policy. And he went on to say, quote, "We take our position based on Canadian values, based on Canadian interests, and what we believe is right," end quote. Again, what is right and what are those Canadian values which are portrayed as universal is, again, not entirely clear. And I think this shift is epitomized by a quote of Janice Stein, and I was on a panel with her, actually on The National, where she said Canada is shifting from being do-gooders to being do-righters. She, in a sense, supported that shift, which surprised me immensely. Now, this new approach has been of a more muscular foreign policy, has been on full display in places like Afghanistan and Libya, but also in Canada's hardline support for Israel, and even, you could go on, our intransigence on climate change and so on. And today I'm going to be contrasting the perceptions of threat in our world expressed by Mr. Harper, his ministers, and others, not to mention other Western leaders south of the border and in Europe, with what I see as in reality the most pressing security challenges that face Canada and the international community in the coming years. So I'll be contrasting the construction of threat by our political leaders with what I see as genuine concerns that face the international community. And I'm going to argue that the world presents a multiplicity of threats today, but the most pressing ones, in my view, tend not to be those emphasized by our leaders. Radical Islamic terrorism and the rogue states that support them, for instance, may still be the boogeyman for Western leaders, but it's hardly the threat it was at the time of 9/11, and you can even make an argument that it wasn't the profound threat that many perceived it to be, despite the major attack that took place on 9/11. The more profound security threats today are more diffuse and difficult to define, but have the potential to be far more destabilizing over the long term. Unlike traditional security threats, and I mean the traditional hard security threats, which tend to affect or target specific actors or groups more than others, whether it's members of particular religious or even groups or even air travelers, the new threats today are less discrete and discriminating. Where I see the major security challenges coming from in the decade ahead are things like cybersecurity and warfare, transnational crime, resource conflict over things like energy and fresh water, and infectious disease. I mean, I could go on. For today's talk, however, I'm going to focus on the first two, and those are cybersecurity and warfare and transnational crime. These threats belie unilateral, national-level responses. They require organized, global, and multilateral initiatives buttressed by strong leadership. The politics of fear with which so many of our political elites resort, because, let's be frank, it's convenient, effective, and powerful, will only hinder, in my view, sustainable solutions. The problem is, in my view, is that the leadership we need to address these genuine threats may not be forthcoming in the years ahead. Our existing superpower, although a declining one at that, is weakened by a troubled economy, unprecedented political deadlock at home, war weariness, and a growing credibility problem abroad. It is, in essence, a hobbled superpower that may be less willing and able to take on a visionary leadership role on important global policy issues. The next superpower, China, has to date showed an unwillingness to take on a robust global leadership role, focusing primarily on its economic growth and looming obstacles presented to it, such as energy supply or demographic change. It has confined its activities to areas of direct national interest, and even played a somewhat unproductive spoiling role in numerous areas, whether it's providing support to Gaddafi, and you could even make some arguments about Syria today. A hobbled superpower and an unwilling superpower in waiting is not necessarily a good formula for robust international leadership. Accordingly, the threats that the world faces in the coming decade are all the more worrying because of a lack of capacity to present organized global responses. Okay, now I'd like to first discuss, before I get into those genuine threats as I put them, I'd like to discuss Islamist terrorism, or what I call the issue we shouldn't be afraid of. In the wake of 9/11, Islamist terrorism, and particularly Al-Qaeda, assumed the mantle of the preeminent threat to Western states and the broader international system. After a decade of the so-called war on terror, this threat has been significantly reduced. Al-Qaeda has lost its leader and its main base of operations, whether it be Afghanistan, it's under severe threat in the Pakistani tribal areas, and so on. The majority of its members have either been killed or are languishing in various prisons across the world. Its operational capabilities have been seriously degraded. Now, this is not to say that it won't inspire future attacks or orchestrate some isolated strikes on its own, but its ability to organize complex operations with a global reach has been drastically reduced. In areas where Al-Qaeda is still present, like the tribal areas of Pakistan, although more limited today, and in Yemen, it is under serious pressure due to US drone strikes, which have had some effectiveness despite concerns over their ethical and legal standing under international law. For instance, a drone strike in Pakistan in late 2011 killed Al-Qaeda's second-in-command, and in a September strike in Pakistan, it killed Anwar al-Awlaki, an American-born cleric who was a leading figure in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arab Spring, for its sake, has showed the bankruptcy of global jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda. Unarmed, secular civilian protesters were able to do in Egypt and Tunisia and other Arab states what a generation of radical Islamists could not: overthrow the Western-backed dictators of those countries. This was, make no mistake, a major ideological blow to Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. And it begs the question, why are we so preoccupied with terrorism, and particularly Islamic terrorism, as a threat, considering that and the other issues that I've mentioned already? Now, to a certain respect, the fear of Islamic terrorism has shifted from the international arena to issues of domestic radicalism and homegrown plots. In the United States, you had the Fort Hood shooter and the Times Square bomber, and we've had some plots here in Canada as well. I think they were the Toronto 11, or the Toronto 8, how many?
18.
18, that's right, thank you.
Ended up being 3.
But if you look at the statistics, again, it debunks the idea that homegrown radicalism is this omnipresent threat as it's often presented. If you look at some of the statistics, 40 Americans have died at the hands of Islamist terrorists since 9/11, domestic Islamist terrorists. That compares with 140,000 Americans who have been murdered over the same period. Of the 14,000 murders that were committed in the United States in 2011, none resulted from Islamic terrorism. None of the terrorists, those 40 terrorists that I've mentioned, had ties with Al-Qaeda. They usually tended to be lone wolf sympathizers, like, for instance, the Toulouse shooter recently in France. If you look at the majority of plots that have been disrupted in the United States by domestic homegrown terrorists, the one adjective that comes to mind is incompetence. They tend not to have been well-constructed threats, well-constructed plots, or major serious threats to the United States. Let's put this in perspective a little bit. In 2001, car crashes claimed the same amount of lives as 9/11 every 26 days. More globally, malaria kills more than 1 million people annually, the equivalent of a 9/11 each day. There was a recent and very important study by Professor Charles Kurzban of the University of North Carolina, who published a book called The Missing Martyrs: Why There Are So Few Muslim Terrorists. And he likens the recent preoccupation with this Islamist terrorism with the wave of anarchist violence in the United States and Western Europe in the early 20th century. And he states, quote, "Islamic terrorism is simply the latest form of transnational revolutionary violence to grab global attention." And, as he argues, it's already passing. As in 9/11, it represented, in his words, a minuscule threat to public safety in the United States and other Western countries when you compare it to things like crime and other major threats to public safety. Despite this reality, Western governments continue to react and overreact, creating a counterproductive hysteria that has demonized Muslim communities. And we've seen that, for instance, in France, where the reaction was to immediately start to round up Muslims, Muslim clerics, and others who have expressed some radical ideas. But it also, how has it caused, what have been the implications of the war on terror and this new focus on domestic extremism on the security sector in the United States and other Western countries? Anne Applebaum, in a recent article in Foreign Policy, argued that there is no evidence at all that America's immense spending on homeland security, particularly heightened security checks at airports, have actually made anyone safer, but has instead provided a convenient mechanism to dole out huge sums of money to favored U.S. congressional districts and companies. She points out that the underwear bomber on Christmas 2009 was stopped by a passenger, not security. The shoe bomber was discovered by a stewardess who smelled something funny, not a sky marshal. And the 2006 Heathrow bomb plot and other Al-Qaeda initiatives like it have been foiled by traditional intelligence gathering, not costly and cumbersome security measures. The reaction to 9/11 was to ramp up counter-terror spending to prevent any conceivable type of terrorist attack. For example, and there are many ridiculous examples of spending, but the Kentucky Charitable Gaming Department received $36,000 to prevent terrorists from raising money at bingo halls. I'm not sure that's been a major target of Al-Qaeda. Since 9/11, Canada has spent an additional $92 billion on security measures on top of what it would have otherwise spent. This fiscal year, or actually it's last fiscal year, Canada will spend $34 billion on national security, $17 billion more than it would have spent by pre-9/11 levels. The reality is that much of these resources are wasted and could be spent better elsewhere. A more focused and sustainable strategy would better identify the most likely forms of attack based on legitimate intelligence and focus resources there. We must remember, though, that even under the best of circumstances, you can't avoid all attacks when they happen, as we've seen with some of these lone gunmen when they have struck. Now, there is a caveat to my argument here, and I do believe that failure in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, or the derailment of the Arab Spring transitions to democracy could breathe new life into Al-Qaeda and some of its affiliate global jihadi groups. So in other words, it wasn't that great a threat But by our actions abroad, we are actually amplifying the potential threat that these groups pose. In Afghanistan, failure to me looks almost inevitable. A renewed civil war, which I think is now a 50-50 proposition, could provide a safe haven for militant Islamist groups of all types once again. We've seen a decline in violence in Iraq, but sectarian tensions remain extremely high. We are still not even close to nearing the end of that conflict, despite the dip in violence. In Libya, we've seen the country is awash with weapons. Hundreds, for instance, of surface-to-air missile batteries and thousands of tons of small arms and ammunition have gone missing or unaccounted for. We have seen militia groups in recent days clash in different areas of the country. A civil war in Libya remains a distinct possibility. In the Arab Spring countries, and let's be clear, we still, although some people say we are moving into an Arab winter, we still are at the beginning of the Arab Spring as well, and this is going to be a messy process. But if democratic reforms bog down, it could open the door for radical Islamists. And here I'm not speaking necessarily about the Muslim Brotherhood, but more like the Al-Noor party and the Salafis and some of their, even the more radical wings within that party. They still enjoy minority support, but we could see that morph into sort of more violent groups that could pose a distinct threat. So we could, as I indicated, be seeing a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our attempts to stamp out Islamic extremism at its core abroad and produce democratic transitions, I should say, in the Islamic world could have the effect of rejuvenating or at least mutating some of the movements that existed and had posed a threat in the past. Moreover, our efforts to stamp out radicalism at home, which I already mentioned, and we've seen things like the King Commission in the US Congress, is stoking Islamophobia and creating disaffection in Muslim communities that could create the type of alienation which could lead to radicalization. However, even with these threats, Islamist terrorism, even if resurgent, will never be the threat that we portray it to be, and it is portrayed to be by our political leaders and in the media. Well, now that we've covered the threat that I believe is overblown, what about the threats that are real? And first I'll take a look at the issue of cybersecurity. Since 2009, there has been a massive increase of cyber attacks on 28 countries, prompting the FBI to rank cyber attacks as the greatest risk to the United States behind weapons of mass destruction. It has also stimulated a U.S. Department of Defense proposal to establish a military cyber command to prepare for a future cyber war, as well as they propose the formation of a NATO Center of Excellence in Cyber Defense. In the 2011 State of the Union address, President Obama called for new legislation to enable law enforcement agencies to combat cyber threats. Of course, with the need to balance those legitimate concerns with issues of internet freedom. I mean, it's clear that this is uncharted territory. Canada hasn't established similar military cyber defense structures, but it is something that's increasingly receiving more and more attention in Ottawa. And there's, of course, major reasons why. In February 2011, it was revealed that the Canadian government networks had been the target of a fairly sophisticated cyber attack. Classified documents were accessed at the Department of Finance, the Treasury Board, the DND's Defense Research and Development Unit, and this attack emanated from servers in China. We also saw, if we look back a little bit, we saw a couple of other major attacks of note. In July of 2009, cyber attacks against major government, news media, and financial websites in South Korea and the United States are believed to have infected as many as 166,000 computers. Another attack in December 2009, this time targeting Google, and believed also to have emanated from China, led to Google's withdrawal from China and prompted U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to warn that states, terrorists, and those who would act as their proxies must know that the United States will protect our networks, whatever that means. And that's the dangerous thing. We don't know exactly what that means, and neither do they. Cybersecurity is now on every government and international organization's agenda. But this has not in all cases led to the level of investment, attention, and institution creation needed to adequately address the problem. One of the issues here is that when I talk about cybersecurity and cyber threats, it's not one problem, but many problems. It's espionage, both corporate and national security related. It can involve economic crimes, including by transnational organized crime and terrorist groups. And it can be, and this is the great worry of most governments, that it could include attacks on critical infrastructure, including transportation systems, air traffic control systems, and electrical grids. Now that leads us to some of the cyber doom scenarios that exist. Examples include attacks against electrical grids leading to mass blackouts, attacks against the financial system leading to economic losses or complete economic collapse, attacks against the transportation system leading to planes and trains crashing, attacks against dams leading for floodgates to open, or attacks, of course, against nuclear power plants leading to meltdowns. Defense Secretary Panetta, in just recent weeks, called the potential of a cyber attack on US infrastructure as his worst nightmare. Now, in the past, these type of catastrophic cyber attacks were really considered the stuff of fantasy, of science fiction. They were not very likely in reality due to the investment in the resiliency of critical infrastructure in the West. Then came the Stuxnet virus in Iran, which is now most likely was constructed by the Central Intelligence Agency, which was able to hobble one of Iran's nuclear power plants in an effort to slow down their supposed move towards creating a nuclear weapon. As a weapon, the thing about cyber warfare and cyber weapons is it's not confined to well-resourced states. Elements, for instance, of the Stuxnet code have actually been replicated by private hackers now. According to the US Department of Homeland Security, in 2011 alone, the Idaho National Laboratory, home to secretive defense labs intended to protect US power grids, water systems, and other critical infrastructure, has responded to triple the number of computer attacks over the previous year, 2010. Vulnerabilities in many US critical systems have been discovered with testing over the past couple of years. As worrying as the cyber doom scenarios are, however, the more serious short-term cyber threats remain cybercrime, and many of us have been victims of that, whether it's through phishing schemes or viruses on the net, to cyber espionage. And now, increasingly, as you may have seen in the media, one of the new, and you could look at this in different ways, governments view it as a threat, corporations view it as a threat, but it also has potential utility, is hacktivism. New global activism using cyber tools, which has been, in actuality, has been responsible for more unauthorized breaches of corporate and government security than cyber criminals over the past years. And one of the dominant groups that we've seen here is the group called Anonymous, which you might have heard of, which just yesterday launched a significant attack against Chinese government servers. Which was one of the first times they attacked the Chinese government. Now, the financial cost of cybercrime is massive and rapidly growing. In 2011, Hewlett-Packard released results showing that the frequency of cyber attacks had increased 45% among the organizations that it sampled, and the cost of cyber attacks had increased by 56%. We're talking here about billions of dollars in losses. Cyber espionage has been documented on a large scale, and I already mentioned a couple examples, both between governments, like China and the United States, and between governments and private firms, and I already mentioned China and Google. If these attacks are verified, they risk escalation and eventually migration into more conventional arenas, security arenas. So for instance, there have been calls for the United States to respond with conventional military force to cyber attacks that amounted to little more than vandalism. How do you respond to those types of attacks? It's new territory. And we don't know how serious that threat is going to become. Now, if we look at, now I'd like to shift gears a little bit, although it is connected to the second threat that I see out there, which I think has to be taken more seriously, which is transnational organized crime. Mexican President Felipe Calderón told the United Nations General Assembly last year that organized crime is killing more people and more youngsters than all the dictatorships of the world put together. And the numbers bear out that picture. More than 47,000 Mexicans have been killed in Mexico's drug war in the last 5 years. And this continues to rise with each passing year. There was an 11% rise in the number of drug-related deaths in Mexico from 2010 to 2011. Mexico and Central America have among the highest murder rates in the world, thanks largely to this transnational organized crime and particularly the drug trade. According to the World Bank, transnational crime and its accompanying violence have cost Central American states up to 8% of their gross domestic product. In July 2011, in an attempt to mount a response to this, the US government released a transnational organized crime strategy. Let me quote from it, because I think it's interesting. In years past, transnational organized crime was largely regional in scope, hierarchically structured, and had only occasional links to terrorism. Today's criminal networks are fluid, striking new alliances with other networks around the world, and engaging in a wide range of illicit activity, including cybercrime, and providing support for terrorism. Virtually every transnational criminal organization and its enterprises are connected and enabled by information systems technology, making cybercrime substantially a more important concern. So here we see the overlap between transnational crime and cybercrime. We have seen a nexus emerge between organized criminal groups and terrorist and militant groups around the world. We see, for instance, in Afghanistan, the Taliban and drug traffickers forming an unholy alliance. We see, for instance, a recent trend that the drug transit trade in Africa is growing dramatically. It's now a $7 to $8 billion trade, in which cocaine, heroin, and amphetamines are trafficked in a corridor through Africa from South America to Europe. It's feeding kleptocratic regimes in places like Guinea-Bissau and other states, and fomenting violence. The U.S. Department of Justice reports that 29 of the 63 organizations on its consolidated priority organization targets list, so their list of the major transnational crime networks in the world, and those who threatened the United States, these 29 of these 63 organizations have links to terrorist groups. Criminal networks play an important role also in driving the global arms trade that fuels numerous conflicts as well as domestic criminality in Western states and here in Canada. The threat that transnational organized crime could facilitate the procurement and transportation of nuclear materials is also a threat that governments are taking more and more seriously. Now, on the issue of illegal narcotics, which is the main driver of these transnational organized crime networks, it's estimated that between 172 and 250 million adults in the world in 2007 used illicit drugs. So it provides a ready source of revenue for these transnational organized crime groups. In Canada and other Western states, the drug trade fuels crime and has had deleterious social and public health impacts. Abroad, it sustains conflict. We've seen that the Taliban has received large amounts of revenue from the drug trade, as well as a number of other groups. These groups, these transnational crime groups, often orchestrate illegal migration, leading to humanitarian tragedies and strains on Western social welfare systems. Now, like cyber warfare, the threat of transnational organized crime has the ability to affect us all. In a January 2011 speech, FBI Director Robert Mueller captured this very well. He said, quote, "How does this impact you? You may not recognize the source, but you will feel the effects. You might pay more for a gallon of gas. You may pay more for a luxury car from overseas. You may pay more for health care, mortgages, clothes, and food. Yet we are concerned with more than just the financial impact. These groups may infiltrate our businesses. They may provide logistical support to hostile foreign powers. They may try to manipulate those at the highest levels of government. Indeed, these so-called iron triangles of organized criminals, corrupt government officials, and business leaders pose a significant threat to national security." Now, organized crime in itself is not a new problem, as you know. It is its growing transnational character, however, and its use of new technologies and interconnections with political violence and corrupt regimes that make it a more pressing global threat today. Now, let me just conclude with a few remarks. Now, I could speak of some other threats today, like changing environmental conditions, causing negative effects like mass population movements and resource competition, or infectious disease. But I'm going to leave it here. Some of the traditional security threats that can continue to preoccupy the media and our political leaders, like terrorism and rogue states, are just not as potent as we are led to believe. These narratives are driven in many cases by political motivations and a growing security industry. The real threats are more diffuse and harder to define, but tend to affect us all more directly. Look, for instance, at infectious disease and resource shortages, threats that affect us all individually. We must change our perception of threat. I believe we must alter our threat priority matrix, dedicating much needed funds to new emerging areas of concern and strategies to enhance our societal resilience. Today's threats tend to evolve and adapt quicker than those of the past, which means we have to stay ahead of the curve in how we conceptualize our responses. It's not about being more afraid of this growing number of threats, but about being smarter. I worry that our global leadership today may not be there to bring about the creative and organized global responses that are needed. Here in Canada, we seem to be drifting back towards more conventional thinking on security when more unconventional thinking is needed. Fortress North America will not protect us from 21st century threats. We need a more vibrant national discussion on the role Canada can play in the global system to create a new security regime that is more resilient in the face of contemporary and future threats. So in other words, I think we have to think about security very differently. So thank you very much.
I want to point out the fact that you're speaking to something called Vital Discussions of Human Security, term that was it Lloyd Axworthy who came up with that term? I think is a very important notion to introduce in the road. It certainly refers to what you're doing. I'm standing because I want to make an interjection before you go on with the questions. And that is, I forgot to tell you, after the talks, I always invite our speakers to supper in the pub of the faculty club. And if any of you want to come and buy your supper and continue the conversation there, you're welcome to do so. It's 44, I think it's 44 Wilcox Street, which is sort of right straight there, very close to Spadina. So we can meet you there if you want to join us for supper. So Mark will certainly take questions for himself. I don't need to field them for him.
Yeah.
How can a group like Anonymous baffle national defense systems?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't really speak to the technical reasons why it can't. But, you know, the fact is that, you know, you have, we've seen that hacker communities are able to adapt and stay ahead of the curve of the security responses of states and corporations. And this is one of the, you know, it's not, this is one of the asymmetrical challenges of the cyber warfare and cyber security, is that you don't need massive resources in order to launch a sophisticated and extremely sophisticated attack. You need the know-how, and that know-how is available. It's available, you know, you don't need to have extremely sophisticated or high-priced education to develop some of that know-how. It's out there in civil society, outside of governments, and, you know, when harnessed for. Now, I think Anonymous has done some very good and innovative things. I mean, they've taken on the drug cartels as well. They broke in and they hacked into the drug cartel networks. They've released documents that I think, I mean, I'm a big believer in transparency and so on. But of course they are viewed by governments as a threat because of the sophistication and the difficulty of detecting where they are. But they are, but I think, you know, there has been some inroads into cracking down on Anonymous, so we'll have to see where that goes.
So they went into child pornography and shut them down too. I'm just
Yeah.
curious, during the Middle East, intelligence communities didn't hire Arab speakers. Is it the case now that the defense system isn't hiring the kind of people who can hack them?
Well, I mean, I think they are, but you know, you know, I think they are hiring people who have these types of capabilities as well. They're the ones who are setting up some of the firewalls and protecting, you know, vital systems. But you know, where there's a challenge, there's often seems to be those in the hacker community who are willing to take it up. And at least some of these groups are taking on sort of a more progressive social stances and progressive political stances, as opposed to just trying to cause havoc and for the sake of that. So the challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go back to Smedley Butler here. And we realize today that everyone in the White House is part of weapons corporations. That's what they do. Chertoff has a conflict of interest with the scanning machines. I mean, Canada sells uranium to everybody. It's a huge, war is a huge industry. It's a real racket, just like he said.
Yeah.
And for me, as an investigative reporter, and I teach here, I'm looking now in the future to see another false flag where the whole damn internet is shut down and blamed on some group like the Arabs. I can see it coming, just like 9/11. Supposed to be Saudis, suddenly they're Iraqis, make war on Iraq. I mean, it's ludicrous. Nobody believes this. Anyone with half a brain doesn't believe any of this. It's not about patriotism or keeping us safe at all. They don't give a damn. We're now suffering from 10 Chernobyls from Fukushima. Do you think any of those nuclear companies give a damn about kids dying from leukemia? It's business. This is, excuse me, a very primitive planet that we're living on, and the head psychopaths are running things, okay? So I'm expecting a big shutdown at the internet, and just like 9/11, another false flag, and have it blamed on some group. So now we have to cut all communications off among you, and it's their fault. That's what I'm expecting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we actually have seen, though, and I mean, different groups come together to resist that type of more heavy-handed action in terms of restricting internet freedom. So I mean, this, for instance, we saw the legislation in the US Congress, which was pushed by the movie industry and the recording industry to try and crack down on internet piracy, which then a combination of activist groups as well as companies involved in information technology came together, resisted, and successfully blocked that legislation. So yeah, I mean, I certainly worry that we are gonna see major, that these type of legitimate threats used as a pretext to cut down on internet freedom. And we know the technology exists to do that. Look at China. I mean, the fact is censorship is alive and well in China. And they have the capability to, in a very sophisticated way, to block access of the majority of their population to sites.
Yeah.
We saw in the Arab world, they were able to cut off the internet completely. That actually baffled many people in the West, how they were able to, these regimes
But you have to
quickly cut off the
remember
internet.
that Google was pointing out dissenters
Yeah.
to the Chinese government.
Mm.
Google was working for them and
Yeah,
finding
but the
dissenters.
Google's out of China for the most
Well,
part.
now they are,
Yeah.
but that's what they were
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah, yeah, I mean,
It's just business,
Yeah.
it's business.
well, I mean, it's certainly one way to look at it, yeah.
That's the way they look at it.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you think that we could alleviate a lot of the problems of the war on drugs by decriminalizing some of the softer elements of drug use?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the problem is all of the focus is on supply side, right? When the reality is that as long as there's a massive demand, and that's why I gave you the statistic of 170 to 220 million regular users of illegal narcotic, because it shows as long as there's that supply side, there's going to be someone who's going to develop this. So you can crack down on drug production in Colombia, but it'll migrate to Mexico. You can crack down on drug production in Afghanistan, it'll migrate to the tribal areas of Pakistan or somewhere else. I mean, the reality is as long as there's a market. So there has to be more creative approaches to dealing with the supply side dimension as well. And then, and one of those creative approaches might be decriminalization or even legalization of something. So, I mean, these type of things have to be considered, but in this political climate, it's difficult. Yeah.
I think that one of the things that causes the government's reaction to things like the threat of terrorism is our demand that they do something.
Mm.
What is there about us that makes us demand that kind of action, whereas you've pointed out, a lot more people are killed in car accidents, and it's not because it's not in the press, because every day you look at somebody else wrapping their car around a post or drinking and driving, but we don't get excited about that, or